So if you have the Yalkut Biurim, I think we got up to page Yud. And again, I just want to repeat the announcement that tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem, we'll get together from 9 till 10. Okay. Now, we're up to Daf Chaf Aleph, and we were mentioning that the Gemara is trying to compare two sets of sins. On the one hand, arayos, and on the other hand, cheating, how I mentioned, with midos and mishkolot, when you, let's say you overcharge a person because the scales are not accurate. And the Gemara thinks that arayos should be more chamur because they generate an isur kares. We have a very interesting question here. So Mitch, if you have the, oh no, this one you don't have, right? Well, you do have it, I forget. Not yet. Okay. Do we have a copy of Yud?
No.
No. Anyway, so the Afla asks the following question. It says that on the one hand, arayos is more chamer because it has an onesh of kares, whereas midos, there's no chiyuv kares. So what did the Gemara mean when it finally came to the conclusion that the onesh of midos is more severe than the onesh of arayos? So the Afla gives the following answer. He says, Adarabah, kevan she'ein chiyuv kares b'midos, this is like counterintuitive, lachein hu chamu. Because basically what the Torah is doing is it's denying you the possibility of tshuva and kapara through kares. Ki im hayu chayovim kares b'midos, then hayu pturim, there would be a ptur. Now watch what goes on here. The Hafla quotes a Gemara in Ksubis, it's also Psachim, of Rabbi Nechuni ben Akana. What is the shita of Rabbi Nechuni ben Akana? He says that whenever you chayiv kares, you don't have to pay damages. Like let's say, for example, a person Kashami burns down his friend's Golish on Shabbos. He cannot be sued for the damages because he's chayiv miso. Chayiv miso according to Chachamim in that case. And let's say he violated the same sreifa on Yom Kippur according to Rav Nechuni ben Akana, he doesn't pay damages because with that sreifa he violates Yom Kippur, which is a chiyuv kares. Therefore, nimtza, in the case of midos, as opposed to arayos, patur mikares, b'zeh gorim lo lios chamur, because if he could pay, let's say you could sue him in a court of law, then that payment would be a form of tshuva, he'd be rectifying his sin. But no one's going to be able to sue him for damages, and therefore he cannot avail himself of that possibility of kapara. And the reason for that is because he's chayiv kares. So now it comes out like this. One second. So let me see if I get the cheshbon. Wait, how does it work now? Again, I thought I had it. If he would be chayiv kares, it says, "Kevet she'ein chiyuv kares b'midos, lachein hu chamur, ki im haya chayiv kares, haya patur mitashlumin." Right. So if he had a chiyuv kares, he would not be liable for damages in a court of law, according to Rabbi Nechuni ben Akana, correct? Because a chiyuv kares knocks off the tashlum. Oh, But now we're saying in the case of Midos, he's potter from kares. Is nimtza shapur mikares. Okay, here's the tricky part. Gorem lo lios chamur. Why? Right. So again, in the case of Midos, he doesn't know who he stole from. Right. That was the Gemara. So therefore, he can't pay the gzela and do tshuva. Now, why is that a chumrah? Now, what's up in the case of Tur Mikares, Gorem Lo, Dios. Oh, I think what he means is like this. Maybe, let me just suggest, and if he doesn't say it, I'll say it. Maybe you'll accept it. Mimonavshak, he doesn't have kapara. If he was chayiv pares and he's not liable for damages, then he gets his kapara through kares. If there's no kares and he's chayiv damages, in the case of Midos, he can't pay damages because he doesn't know who he stole from. So in a paradoxical sense, the p'tur of kares is a chumrah. Why? Because he has no option of kapara through tashlumin because he doesn't know from whom he stole. And therefore his last fallback position for kapara, his method for kapara would only be kares. And now you're telling me, well, he's not even chayiv kares. So Mimanav Shaki, he's out there in the cold. He has no kapara. The Ode, now he gives another explanation. He says, Masha ein lo chiv kares, ze mipnei chumrasa. It's not that the chumrah is that he's not chayiv kares, and we're denying him kares, but it's a siman l'davar. I'm going to prove to you how chumr this avera is, because the fact that he has no kares must be a result of the chumrah's avera. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not even giving him and making it available for him the method of kapara of kares. So Masha ein lo chiv kares, which denies him the possibility of kapara, that itself is indicative of the chumras haver. What's counterintuitive here, but it's emes, is that when God gives a punishment, that's a good thing. You would think, oh no, it's terrible. But it's not. It's God is saying, I'm going to afford you with the possibility of tshuva and kapara. Okay. Now let's go back. Again, I want to review this Gemara that we did a few days ago. The Gemara is looking for a source for shnios larayos in the Torah. So if you look at the fourth of the wide lines here on Daf Chaf Aleph, what we learned at the end of last week, Rabbi Yehuda has a different source, a remez for the Isur Shnios Mehacha, a pasuk in Koheles. The Izain v'chiker tikein mitsholim harbe. And the end of the pasuk says, "L'lamed esa'om tamei uklolei Torah." No, that's not in the pasuk. In any event, it comes out that Rabbi Yehuda holds that when the pasuk describes Shlomo as v'izein v'chiker v'tiker, this is a reference, an allusion to Shnius Larayos. Okay, so far so good. Now, there's a Gemara in Eruvin, and the Gemara in Eruvin on Daf Chaf Aleph, it's interesting, both on Chaf Aleph, lists the takanas of Shlomo when a Baskol came out of heaven and quoted this very pasuk in Koheles. And the Gemara's language is B'shosha tikein Shlomo netilas yadayim ve'eruvin. Listen to this. the greatness, as the Bas Kol declared it, of Shlomo's Takana was number one, Netilas Yadayim, number two, Erevin. No mention of Shnias Larayos. Do you see Tosas Dibra Maskal Rabbi Yehuda? V'hadi Amar Perek Sheni the Erevin b'Shoshet Tikei Shlomo Netilas Yadayim Erev Yotza Bas Kol v'Amra v'lo Chashiv Shnios. And you put a question mark here. Shema Achar Bas Kol Tik. The Tosas has no, shall I say, no smooth, easy answer to this question. Why the Gemara omitted Shnio? So he says, you know what? Maybe historically, chronologically, this takana of Arayos came after the Bas Kol. Okay, the Gemara somehow knew that. However, if you take a look on if you have it in your Gemara, on the left column in small print, there's something called Tosas Yeshonim. He says, I'm trying to find this, the last piece, do you see that? The Imtomar Hasan Perik, blah, 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 is Chashiv Erevin Tils Yadayim, etc., etc. Amaylo Chashiv Shniyos. Hishlomar, Lo Chashiv El Dover Atoli Bechachma Ubesvaras Halev. Aval Hacha Ein Adover Toli Bechachma El Lahachmir V'Laso Siag L'Torah. I understand it correctly, he's saying that in both Netilas Yadayim and Erevin, Shlomo came up with his brilliant mind with an entirely new enterprise. He wasn't just creating a siyag, and saying, well, you know what, psychologically, if you come this close to sin, you might violate the sin itself. But rather, Netilas Yadayim was an entire new entity, the purpose of which was Shmira, was to guard from Tumah. In the case of Truma and so forth and so on, Erevin was a whole new institution to keep people within a certain area, but allow them, when necessary, to go beyond that area. So you have many chatzeros, and they share one mavui, or many different batim that share a single chatzer. This was a whole new invention, and the lumpness of it is that Yadayim Shniyos Larayos, and then there's something called Taras HaYadayim, that you could be retired just in Yadayim, or in the case of Erevin, that we view all the Chatzeros as one single Rishus when they're Michtatef Be'erev. But in the case of Shniyos Larayos, that doesn't take any new brilliant breakthrough. There's no revolution creating a new enterprise in Allah, but rather it requires that you assess the situation, that if we allow this, then they might come to violate a severe Isur of error. But now he quotes a sefer called the Yalkut Gershuni, which I think I have, but go find. Anyway, he says the following. Perhaps the first takon of Shlomo, this is the exact opposite of Toph, was Shnios Larayos. Only afterwards, Shlomo established Netilas Yadayim and Erevin. Ach, mishum takona achas, lo hoisa yotzeis baskol, l'shvocho shel zeh, rak alacher sheshina v'shilesh l'taken, gam b'Netilas Yadayim u'be'erevin, v'huchsa gimel pa'am v'chachmaso yotze baskol v'yomro, im chacham v'ni yismach libi gam ani. And what the Yalkut Gershuni is claiming is that the premise of Tosas' Kasha, or Tosas Yeshonim's Kasha, is correct. That the Bas Kol was not only on Erevin and Netilas Yadayim, but it was on all three. The only reason he mentions the second and the third is to indicate that the Bas Kol would only declare the greatness of Shlomo after a Chazaka was established. After a second takana, and then a third takana, when Shlomo proves and demonstrates consistently that he's able to mitaki these great takanas on behalf of Klal Yisrael, then the Baskol comes out, the Shevach for a praise. And finally, he quotes another sefer, which I'm not familiar with, called Motzach Chen. Takana lo shayach rak b'dorach chadash. V'chein l'krotzo b'shem chacham, right? The Baskol came out and said and declared that this man is a chacham and yismach libi. Lo shayach alam kein tikein dover chadash, shu dover dvar chacham. So that Erevin and Etilas Yadayim are called Takanos Chadoshos. This is not an extension of a biblical law. It's a brand new enterprise, a new creation. But Iser Shnios, Eino Iser Chadosh, Elahu Hosafal Isurei Torah, the Lo Yotzal Zebask. Very similar to Tosas, I think. I mean to say to Tosas Yishanim, that's what I meant to say. Now it's interesting that the Gemara's language here is on the next, if you just fast forward the lines, and we said that Aznayim are like handles. But he offers an alternative shot in the name of the Ben Yehoyada, that's the Ben Ish Chai, that the word Aznayim, or the concept of Shmiya, of listening, is indicative of what we call Torah Shebal Peh. Right? We have Torah Shebal, and there you can see the Torah itself. And then there's something called Torah Shebal Peh, where you hear it. And the Gemara wants to emphasize that the takanos of Shlomo HaMelech become part of Torah Shebal Peh, which relates to the ears, as opposed to the eyes in the case of Torah Shevichsa. Okay, now we take a look at Rav Ashi. Omar Rav Ashi, a few lines later. Just 1 second. Moshal, the Rabbi Oshaya Lema Doradom. So the sheet of Rav Oshia, based on a pasuk in Mishlei, was that the source in the Tanakh for the Iser Shnios is the pasuk Parehu. And what does Parehu mean? Parehu means that you expand the Iser that's mentioned in the pasuk, namely the Iser Rayos. And why? She'al Yavar Tavar Bo. Sote, like Sote's motion steel, we said, to veer away, may olav yavo. So that you might, if you don't expand the Iser Arayos by adding Shnios Arayos, a person might be nichshal in the Arayos themselves. Omar of Ashi, Moshel. If I want to give some sort of a simile that we should be expanding the Iser itself, the Rabbi Oshia, based on this concept of Rabbi Oshia, the Adam Mishamer Pardes, who Mishamer Bachutz is Kula Mishtam. Mishtam Ruftim is Lefana Mishtam Leachor of Eina Mishtam. Now he has again a sefer, I'm not familiar with it, Mishkas Aaron. He says, Madua Omer of Ashi is Hamoshel Nakudas of Oshia. And we had all sorts of possibilities as to what's the source for the Iser Shnios. Why is he pinning himself on Rav Oshia? And he answers the following. Rav Ashi hukshalo kfelus haposuk shehevi Rav Oshi shekeman chechsiv or eu al tavarbo madua chazer v'kafal shtei olav havor. So if you divide up the posuk into two, you have what seems to be a repetition. Al tavarbo, and then it says shtei me'olav havor. What's the difference between the reach of the pasuk and the sefer? L'chein pirush Rav Ashi shemashe nirvas pasuk hazeh isu shnios moil lo rak lahazhir lizar meisur arayos atzman el afil lisrachik minyonei kiur barayos yigon istaklus ol ariach bismeim bisameim, and that's the kvelos hapasuk. Ayideshet lipara v'tagdil isur lozu bilvad shelo taver. We're not only trying to prevent you from violating the isur itself, but rather ella shtei me'olav havar hisrachek afilu midivrei kiur. Right, kiur are different kinds of like, how would you say the opposite of tzlius? Certain kinds of maybe preachers. You familiar with that word, preachers? How would you translate that word? I don't know. The opposite of modesty in English. I don't know. Immodest. Okay. So certain kinds of immodest behavior. Where you look at women and you gaze at them, or you try to get close to them and smell their perfume and all that stuff. So that's called a kiur. Kiur. Kiur means like, it looks like, you're being, what was the word we used the other day? Licentious, was that the word? He says, "V'zeu gam bira mashal shehimshel Rav Ashi. She'isur shnius domeh lemeshamer es hapardes mibachutz." If he's on the outside, he doesn't go near the paradise. He's guarding it. Shemeshamer es kulo. And achar gzeira shel shnios, Hareza Mishamar is kol inyan Isa Rayas ubechlolam kol inyane kiu. I don't know how he makes that jump, honestly, but he's saying that the nimshal, when you speak about guarding the orchard from the outside and making sure that no one goes near it, is shnios larayos. Now, I'm not sure exactly why he assumes that shnios larayos includes kiur. Aval im mishamar mibafnim mishamar rak mashal lefanav velo mashal yach. Vanim shalusha in lo, it goes around lisa shnios ayivishtav rak yisrael va'atzma val ma shal yachorav dainu dvarim ha'tfeilim lisa Erva, right? That's the kior of Istaklus and Lariach, etc. Lo hayamishtam. Again, I don't know exactly what is this interdependence. Can anybody explain it to me? He connects two things, A and B. The Shnios Larayos now is connected to the kior, which is Me'achora. And he says that somehow through this institution of the Isur Shnios Arayos, we're going to cover even Zahirus, separating oneself even from Kiyur. I didn't understand that part of that piece of the puzzle. All right, so now we go back to the sugya itself and all the diagrams here. I don't know, do you have these diagrams or not? All right. Iboiluhu. So now we're on Chaf Aleph Amid Beis. This is where we got up to yesterday. And you see Tosfos Dima Masler Rav Ashi, the second Tosfos. So you drop down around 4 or 5 lines. And you'll see the 2 dots. And then Iboiluhu. All right. So this is this is the heavy part of Yevamot that requires all these diagrams and calculations. But we'll try it. Eshes achi ha'em min ha'em mahu. So we have an uncle who is the brother of his mother. And the question is, what's the status of his wife, which would be the aunt by marriage? So it's your maternal uncle's wife. So again, he has here a whole long description with all the names. I'm going to, for the time being, skip it. We'll come back to it. But I just want to analyze the suffix, just in abstract terms. He says, Be'eshes achi ha'av min ha'em u'be'eshes achi ha'em min ha'av de'ika tzad av. That's included in Shnias Larayos, U'degazu Rabbanan, Aval Heicha Deleka Tzad Av, Lo Gazu Lahu Bahu Rabbanan, and then Odin Loshna. So we have three cases. 2 out of 3 have what's called a Tzad Av. And the third, which is the question that we're raising here in this Ibalu, has no Tzad Av whatsoever. So which cases have a Tzad Av? We have Eshes Achia Av, that means my uncle, because he is my father's paternal brother, and his wife is my aunt by marriage, that has a Tzad Av. I'm sorry. I jumped the gun. Let's go slow. Eshes achia av min ha'em. So it's not achia ha'em min ha'em. So I'm not talking about my uncle, meaning my mother's brother, who's only a maternal brother. So it's through my mother and her relationship to her brother's maternal. You follow? Everybody with me on that? The suffix of the Gemara is with, you have a double maternal relationship. On the one hand, we're talking about your mother's brother, and on the other hand, that uncle is a brother to your mother through the common mother. However, in the second case, which clearly is included in the Gzeira D'Rabbanan, we have Eshes Achi Ha'av min ha'em. Now, it's true that your father and his brother are maternal brothers, correct? But we're going through your father, so we have a Tzad Av. Then we have the case of Eshes Achi Ha'em min ha'av. So now we have your mother's brother, but at least your mother and her brother have the same father. They are paternal brother and sister. So it's your mother's brother, and your mother and her brother share the same mother. There's no tzada av. Is then lo gazu be'Rabbanan. Okay. Odilma lochna, which means that even Eshes Achia Em and Em is also included in the Gzeira. Now, if I'm not mistaken, okay, I'm going to take a step out into the wild blue yonder here. I hope I'm not going to fall. The Torah itself prohibits Eshes Achi Ha'av min ha'av. Steve, you remember that for me? Eshes Achi Ha'av min ha'av. Which means that you have a double Av relationship. It's your uncle because he is your father's brother. And not only that, he and your father, he and his brother, meaning the two brothers, meaning your father and your uncle, share the same father. We have two Avs. Now, in our case, of Eishes Achi Ha'em Min Ha'em, we're missing both conditions to the Isur Torah. In the other two cases, let's go over them one more time. At least we have one of those two conditions. We've got Eishes Achi Ha'av, so it's your father's brother, albeit their brother's paternal, or it's Eishes Achi Ha'em Min Ha'av, that although it's your mother's brother, but she and her brother, your uncle, share the same father. But if it's your mother's brother through the same mother, then it's -2. And in the Gemara's Lo Shna, he says that we're going to prohibit Eishes Achi Ha'em Min Ha'em, Gzeira Mishum Eishes Achi Ha'em Min Ha'av. Now, wait a second. Eishes Achi Ha'em Min Ha'av is already a drabban. Why? Because it's your uncle on your mother's side. It's your mother's brother. And we said the Torah only prohibits your father's brother, meaning the wife of your father's brother. Somewhere of Safra, he gufa gzera vanan neku v'nigzar gzera l'gzera. Now, as you're worried about the other uncle, the uncle who is your father's brother. So that itself is one gzera. Now you're adding another gzera because not only is it your mother's brother, not your father's brother, but he, that uncle of yours, is not your mother's brother min ha'av, but rather min ha'em. And we require two things. We require ach aviv plus achim min ha'av. So you're missing two things. Amar Rava is now rejecting Rav Safra, otu kulu. Lav gzera l'gzera ninu. I'm going to prove to you that shnias larayas, by definition, is gzera l'gzera. How do I prove this to you? Imo is an erva. Aim imo, which means his maternal grandmother, is shnia. That's a drabbanan. Now gazru, on top of this isu shnia, al aim aviv. Mishum aim ima. I don't understand. Why is aim aviv any different than aim ima? Second. Oh, I see. In other words, when you go to the grandparent, you go through the parent. So if the parent is female, you had an erva with the parent, that's your mother, now you go to the next female, which is your mother's mother. But in the case of your paternal grandmother, how do you get from square one to square two, if you follow me? There's Aviv. I mean, Aviv is not included in Arayos. I mean, it would be Mishkav Zohar, but it's not a separate erva of Aviv. So Aim Aviv would only be logically prohibited because of Gzera or to Aim Ima. Do you follow that? Because in Aim Aviv, there's no inherent extension to create a Shnias Larayas. So you're going to have to say it's a Shnias Larayas or to another Shnias Larayas. Okay, the time of my so Taka, why is your paternal grandmother Asur, even though there's no Isur Erev at all? And the answer is Kulu Debei Ima Rabasi Karlu. As we're talking about a grandparent, whether it's your mother's mother or your father's mother, we all call it by one name. You follow? It's always called tzavta. It's always called the grandma. You can have a grandmother because it's your mother's mother, or a grandmother because it's your father's mother. So I think I'm going to take a shot at this, that when it says v'taima mai, meaning in the case of your paternal grandmother, Taka, why do we apply the principle of, why do we validate gzeira l'gzeira? That's what Rav was asking. And the answer is because it's all shem echad. So that's not called a gzeira l'gzeira. Like, for example, I don't know if this is a fair analogy, but you're not allowed to put milk and meat on the same table that you're eating from. I mean, maybe you have to make a sima, whatever the requirements are. Now, that's because you might come to eat them together. But even if you eat them together, you don't violate basar b'chol because they weren't cooked together. So eating milchiks and fleishiks together is itself a gzeira, because you might come to be mavashal them together. Now you tell me I can't even put them on the table together. But the answer is it's all one shem. In other words, it's all one category called basar b'chol. So it's not a gzeira l'gzeira. And here too, all grandparents, in this case grandmothers, come under the same name. And now we're going to add uncles and aunts. You follow what I mean? The uncle, which could be your father's brother, or it could be your uncle because it's your mother's brother. So that's all called Dod, and his wife is Dodaso, and it all has one shame, Dodaso. Now you can ask me, but it's Gzeira l'Gzeira, because you're talking about my mother's brother through a common mother, but the answer is it doesn't matter, because my mother's brother's wife is called Dodaso. Now Rav is going to give another example of Isur Shniyos, which is L'chora Gzeira L'Gzeira, but it's not. So Eishes Aviv Erva. Okay, so the Torah prohibits you to have a relationship with your father's wife. Eishes Avi Aviv, what about your grandfather? That's also Asum Rabbanan, Shniya. The Gazru Al Eishes Avi Imo, Mishum Eishes Avi Aviv. So we're talking about your step grandma. Now, what kind of step grandmother are we talking about? If we're talking about Eishes Avi Aviv, meaning you just add one generation from Aviv, which is the Torah law, right? You follow on the mother's side, you can't talk about Eishes Aviv, right? Because that'll be a male if you follow it. So to get a female for the Erva, you have to talk about Eishes Aviv. Now we're adding Eishes Avi Aviv, correct? Now, what happens when you add a female into the equation? So it becomes Eishes Avi Imo, which is your maternal grandfather, and his wife now becomes us. But that itself is a gzeira. So that gzeira is atu Eishes Avi Aviv, right? Eishes Avi Imo is a gzeira l'gzeira. Why? Because Eishes Avi Imo is a gzeira atu Eishes Avi Aviv. And Eishes Avi Aviv itself is a gzeira atu Eishes Aviv. Time Amai, why do we do it? The Kulu, the Bei Abba Rabba Korlu. They're all called Saba, Beit Saba. Another example. Eishes Achi Ha'av. So we have, this I think coming back to our sugya, let's come, right? You have an aunt who is what? Who is married to your father's brother. Now, how is this uncle your father's brother? Well, I should say the other way around. How is your father's brother your uncle? Mina'at. Correct? They share the same father. Erva. So this is the erva which the Torah calls Eshes Achiv. What's Eshes Achiv? No, I'm sorry. Eshes Achi Aviv. That means Aviv Mina'at. Achiv Mina'at, right? Achiv Mina'av means that his father's brother and his father share the same father. So such an uncle, who's your father's paternal brother, generates an erva of Eshes Achi Av Mina'at. That's a doraisa. Okay. Now let's get to Eshes Achi Av Mina'en. So now you have your uncle, that's your father's brother, because they share the same mother. That's a shnia. Because al Eshes Achi Ha'em Mina'av. Okay, fine. Now we're talking about the wife of your uncle on your mother's side, and that's going to be Gzeira Mishum Eshes Achi Ha'av Mina'em. Now, Eshes Achi Ha'av Mina'em is itself a shnia. So now you have Eshes Achi Ha'av Mina'em as a Gzeira or to Eshes Achi Ha'av Mina'av. And Eshes Achi Ha'av Mina'av is itself a Gzeira. They're all called base dodo. So this is not Gzeira l'Gzeira. Now, what's my? So until now, we've been discussing a case of Eshes Achi Ha'av Mina'en. Second, Eshes Achi Ha'av. Oh, but it's always Achi Ha'av. But what about a case of Eshes Achi Imo Mina'en? So I'm not sure. I thought that Rava was clear cut about this. He was definite about this. So Rava, I guess, is just rejecting the argument of Rav Safra of Gzeira l'Gzeira. But I guess he didn't come to any definite conclusion. Well, maybe just the Gemara is asking, Mai, how do we paskin? Maybe, I don't know. Let's just see. Oh, he quotes a Marsha here. Footnote number Yud Gimel. He says, "V'af shegam Eshes Achi Ha'av Mina'en Kruya Bei Dodi Mikom Gon Istapa Gemara Shemalo Asrua Kevan She'ein Bo Tzad A." So even though it's called dodo, but there is, in all the other cases of dodo that we discussed, there is a tzad ha'av. Here there's no tzad ha'av. It's his mother's brother, and his mother's brother is his mother's brother because they share the same mother. So there's no tzad ha'av at all. Wow. All this could be very practical. I mean, it doesn't sound so common, but I'm sure it could be common. Like, for example, I don't know if anyone could say the same thing that I could say. I have a nephew who's 4 years younger than me. Anybody say that? I mean, you could have an uncle that's younger than you. And in this case, the uncle that's me, he's 4 years older than my nephew. So you could have a situation where your uncle is so close in age to you that his wife I mean, chas v'shalom, but liachar me'av yesrim, his wife could be of marriageable age for you. You know what I mean? You know, we think of uncles and nephews as being, 20 years apart, but that's not necessarily so. So, for example, my nephew is the son of the oldest sibling of our brothers and sisters. I'm the youngest. We were 5 siblings, so separated by many, many years. I know cases, I know one family that she's older than 2 of her uncles, not just one. And that happens when you have, families that are producing children over a long period of time. And then you could have also a situation where you had 2 different mothers, you're married a second time. So usually that means he came from Eretz Bava. Omar, he brought a tradition from Marava. Omri b'Marava, they said in Eretz Yisrael, a principle with regard to Isur Shnios. Kol sheben ekeva erva, v'zocher gazu al ishto mishum shniya. Let's see how we interpret these words. Kol sheben ekeva erva is bezachar gazal ishto mishum shniya. I think means that if you have a family relationship which is almost identical to a case of an akeva, but it's a zachar, then ishto is like the zachar. And that's called a shnir. So the wife of a zachar, who had he been an akeva, would be considered an erva. That's called a shnir. Now, is that going to prove anything? Let's see if we can apply that to Eishes Ach Mina'em. Let's see, Eishes Ach Mina'em, right? So that's a case of an aunt and second, Eishes Ach Mina'em. I don't see how the principle applies. Omar Rava Uklalahu. This principle that Rabbi Yehuda quoted from Marava, is it really a klal? I'm going to disprove it. Because Amoso, right? So that's his wife's mother, is erva. Right? That's a Torah erva. And what about a case of Eshes Hamid, right? The wife of his father-in-law. So had his father-in-law been a female, his wife would be Chamoso. So therefore, we should say Eshes Hamid should also be prohibited, and yet Muteris. So he gives an example here. Avram marries Sarah and Rivka. From Sarah, he has a daughter named Roch, who marries Yitzchak. And Avram dies. Rivka, he Eshes Chamiv Shel Yitzchak. She is the wife of Yitzchak's father-in-law. Right, and I think we discussed this at one point. Muteris. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda Bar Shiloh's principle, she should be Asura Mishum Shniya, because Chamiv and Chamoso are equal in terms of their relationship. They have the same relationship. And just Chamoso is also in a Torah, we should have a Gzeir of Eshes Chamiv, since Chamiv and Chamoso have the same, family structure. And furthermore, Rava gives another example, Bas Chamoso, Erva. Now, Bas Chamoso is the same as Achos Ichta, right? It's his wife's sister. Now, what's Eshes ben Chamoso? Let's say his wife's brother gets married, Muteris. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this should be Shnios. Why? We're saying that Bas Kamoso is an erva. And now we have Ben Chamoso. I guess Ben Chamoso is the same identical relationship as Bas Chamoso. Therefore, Ben Chamoso, so to speak, becomes an erva of Bas Chamoso, which means that his wife now plugs in instead of him. So it becomes Bas Chamoso. Another example, Bas Chaviv is erva, Doraisa, correct? Why? Because that's again, like we said before, in Bas Chamoso, Bas Chaviv is Achos Ishto. The Eshes ben Chaviv Muteres. Now, if Bas Chaviv is an Erev Doraisa, then Ben Chaviv should be a Shniel Arais, according to Rabbi Yehuda, should be a Shniel Arayos, and instead of Ben, we'll put in Eshes ben Chaviv. And yet Eshes ben Chaviv is Muteres. Next, Choragto. Okay. Now we're talking about step children. So Bas Ishto, so his wife was married previously. She brought in a daughter to the marriage, and that daughter is called Choragta. She's an Erev, right? The Torah says you're not allowed to marry Bas Ishto. Now, what about Eshes Chorga? Let's say his wife brought in a son from a previous marriage. So that son, that stepson, should have the identical status, according to Rabbi Yehuda, as the stepdaughter. Just that instead of the stepson, will plug in his wife, and yet Muteres. So you're allowed to marry the wife of your stepson. Next, Bas Choragto. So we said Choragto was the daughter that your wife, brought into the marriage. Now, that daughter that she brought in has a daughter, which is your wife's granddaughter. That's an Erev Min Torah. Right? You can't marry your wife's daughter or her granddaughter, according to Torah law. I don't know where the psukim are from this, but we'll see. Now, what about Eshes ben Chorga, right? So let's say your wife brought in a son to the marriage who should have the same status as your daughter, except it's a male, but we're imagining that it would be a female, and if your son, your stepson, has a daughter, which would be your wife's granddaughter, then she should be Asura Mitin, Rabbi Yehuda's understanding of Shnios, Muteres, and yet you're allowed to marry her. So now let's go back to the case of Achi Imo Min Ha'em, Achi Imo Min Ha'em. And he says the following. If in all the cases that we mentioned before, there's a heter, and we don't apply the principle of Rabbi Yehuda ben Shiloh, is Had Rabbi Yeshua ben Shilo Lasuyeman. So in what case do we apply Rabbi Yehuda ben Bar Shilo that if we plug in the wife of a Zachar instead of an Akeva, then there's an Isur Shlias Larayos, Lasuyeman. I mean, we haven't come up with any single case where the Isur applies, because in all those cases we prove that it's mutter. Lav, shouldn't we say by process of elimination? Lasuye eshes achi ha'em min ha'em. And how do we apply Rabbi Yehuda's principle? Dechol sheben akeva erva bi zachar gazal ishto mishum shniya. So the Torah prohibits ervas achos imcha. So you're not allowed to marry your mother's sister, and that applies to your mother's sister who is either your mother's paternal or maternal sister. That is not. Right? So the sister relationship between your mother and your aunt could either be maternal or paternal, and that creates an erva. So therefore, in our case of, again, Ashes, right? The Ashes part will fit in at the end of this equation, but Achi ha'em min ha'em, right? Because em min ha'em means your mother's sister, and it doesn't matter whether they are sisters through the same father or sisters through the same mother, is therefore Achi ha'em min ha'em is just going to plug in to Achos imo. And whenever you have a male, you just add his wife to replace him. But now the Gemara is going to ask the obvious question: Maishna hani u'maishna ha. So why is it that in all the other cases, Rava says they were matir, and they didn't apply the Gzeira Shnias Larayas without applying the principle of Rabbi Yehuda? But here, in the case of H's Dodo, which means Achi Imo Min Ha'em, they asked him. So the Gemara explains, Ha, Bechad Kedushin Makarev Lo, Hani Adeika Trei Kedushin Lo Makarev. In the case of an uncle who is your mother's brother and they share the same mother, then there's one Kedusha that generates this erva. And that means a woman who got married to your uncle. That makes her your relative, your aunt. But in all the other cases of Rava, we need Shrei Kedusha. We need two Maisa Kedusha. So therefore, the Gzeira will only apply to Eshes Dodo, which is Achi Imo Min Ha'em. And that's considered a very close relative because it's Al Yidei Maisa Kedushin Echad, but not Eshes Chamiv, which is Al Yidei Shnei Maisa Kedushin. That means his marriage to his wife, and now another marriage to one of the male descendants of his wife. So you require two marriage relationships. He says, and with this we'll have to wrap it up, he says, V'lo Eshes Chamiv, Shedafka Al Yidei Shnei Maisa Kedushin, Shem HaKedushin Shelo Be'ishto, V'gam HaKedushin Shel Chamiv Be'ishto. 1 second, what does it mean, Kedushin Shel Chamiv Be'ishto? What was the second marriage? Oh, right. This is his father-in-law's wife, right? In that case of Yitzchak and all that. So it requires your marriage to your wife and your father-in-law's marriage, that means your wife's father's marriage to another woman. You follow what it's to Kedushin. Very clever. So this is his wife's grandson. First of all, he marries his wife. And then his wife brought in a son into the marriage. And he had to get married as a, right? This is Kedusha number 2. Just 1 second. And that woman who's married to your stepson is a relative of yours through Kedusha. Number 1, it's through your marriage to your wife. And number 2, your wife brought in a son from the marriage and he was married to someone else. Okay, then? So this is where we'll stop. Not bad. I mean, I'll tell you the truth. I was sittering from learning this Gemara. Anybody see a pencil here? Oh, there it is. So wait a minute, where is this in the Gemara? This is about 10 lines up from the bottom. Sholach Le, right? Sholach Le Rav Moshe. Okay.